Chapter 1 of Book 1 of On the Heavens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards. On the Heavens by Aristotle. Translated by J. L. Stocks. Chapter 1. The science which has to do with nature clearly concerns itself for the most part with bodies and magnitudes, and their properties and movements, but also with the principles of this sort of substance, as many as they may be. For of things constituted by nature, some are bodies and magnitudes, some possess body and magnitude, and some are principles of things which possess these. Now, a continuum is that which is divisible into parts always capable of subdivision, and a body is that which is every way divisible. A magnitude, if divisible one way, is a line, if two ways, a surface, and if three, a body. Beyond these there is no other magnitude, because the three dimensions are all that there are, and that which is divisible in three directions is divisible in all. For, as the Pythagoreans say, the world and all that is in it is determined by the number 3, since beginning and middle and end give the number of an all, and the number they give is the triad. And so, having taken these three from nature as, so to speak, laws of it, we make further use of the number 3 in the worship of the gods. Further, we use the terms in practice in this way. Of two things, or men, we say 'both', but not 'all'. 3 is the first number to which the term 'all' has been appropriated, and in this, as we have said, we do but follow the lead which nature gives. Therefore, since 'every' and 'all' and 'complete' do not differ from one another in respect of form, but only, if at all, in their matter and in that to which they are applied, body alone among magnitudes can be complete. For it alone is determined by the three dimensions, that is an 'all'. But if it is divisible in three dimensions, it is every way divisible, while the other magnitudes are divisible in one dimension or in two alone. For the divisibility and continuity of magnitudes depend upon the number of the dimensions, one sort being continuous in one direction, another in two, another in all. All magnitudes, then, which are divisible are also continuous. Whether we can also say that whatever is continuous is divisible does not yet, on our present grounds, appear. One thing, however, is clear. We cannot pass beyond body to a further kind, as we passed from length to surface, and from surface to body. For, if we could, it would cease to be true that body is complete magnitude. We could pass beyond it only in virtue of a defect in it, and that which is complete cannot be defective, since it has being in every respect. Now bodies which are classed as parts of the whole are each complete according to our formula, since each possesses every dimension, but each is determined relatively to that part which is next to it by contact, for which reason each of them is in a sense many bodies. But the whole, of which they are parts, must necessarily be complete, and thus, in accordance with the meaning of the word, have being, not in some respects only, but in every respect. Chapter 2. The question as to the nature of the whole, whether it is infinite in size or limited in its total mass, is a matter for subsequent inquiry. We will now speak of those parts of the whole which are specifically distinct. Let us take this as our starting point. All natural bodies and magnitudes we hold to be, as such, capable of locomotion, for nature, we say, is their principle of movement. But all movement that is in place, all locomotion, as we term it, is either straight or circular or a combination of these two, which are the only simple movements. And the reason of this is that these two, the straight and the circular line, are the only simple magnitudes. Now, revolution about the centre is circular motion, while the upward and downward movements are in a straight line. Quotes upward meaning motion away from the centre, and quotes downward motion towards it. All simple motion, then, must be motion either away from, or towards, or about the centre. This seems to be in exact accord with what we said above. As body found its completion in 3 dimensions, so its movement completes itself in 3 forms. Bodies are either simple or compounded of such, and by simple bodies I mean those which possess a principle of movement in their own nature, such as fire and earth with their kinds, and whatever is akin to them. Necessarily, then, movements also will be either simple or in some sort compound. Simple in the case of the simple bodies, compound in that of the composite, and in the latter case the motion will be that of the simple body which prevails in the composition. Supposing then that there is such a thing as simple movement, and that circular movement is an instance of it, and that both movement of a simple body is simple, and simple movement is of a simple body, for if it is movement of a compound it will be in virtue of a prevailing simple element, then there must necessarily be some simple body which revolves naturally and in virtue of its own nature with a circular movement. By constraint, of course, it may be brought to move with the motion of something else different from itself, but it cannot so move naturally, since there is one sort of movement natural to each of the simple bodies. Again, if the unnatural movement is the contrary of the natural, and a thing can have no more than one contrary, it will follow that circular movement, being a simple motion, must be unnatural, if it is not natural to the body moved. If then 1. The body whose movement is circular is fire, or some other element, its natural motion must be the contrary of the circular motion. But a single thing has a single contrary, and upward and downward motion are the contraries of one another. If, on the other hand, 2. The body moving with the circular motion which is unnatural to it is something different from the elements, there will be some other motion which is natural to it. But this cannot be. For if the natural motion is upward, it will be fire or air, and if downward, water or earth. Further, this circular motion is necessarily primary, for the perfect is naturally prior to the imperfect, and the circle is a perfect thing. This cannot be said of any straight line, not of an infinite line, for if it were perfect it would have a limit and an end, nor of any finite line, for in every case there is something beyond it, since any finite line can be extended. And so, since the prior movement belongs to the body which is naturally prior, and circular movement is prior to straight, and movement in a straight line belongs to simple bodies, fire moving straight upward and earthy bodies straight downward towards the centre, since this is so, it follows that circular movement also must be the movement of some simple body. For the movement of composite bodies is, as we said, determined by that simple body which preponderates in the composition. These premises clearly give the conclusion that there is in nature some bodily substance other than the formations we know, prior to them all, and more divine than they. But it may also be proved as follows. We may take it that all movement is either natural or unnatural, and that the movement which is unnatural to one body is natural to another, as for instance is the case with the upward and downward movements, which are natural and unnatural to fire and earth respectively. It necessarily follows that circular movement, being unnatural to these bodies, is the natural movement of some other. Further, if on the one hand circular movement is natural to something, it must surely be some simple and primary body which is ordained to move with a natural circular motion, as fire is ordained to fly up and earth down. If, on the other hand, the movement of the rotating bodies about the centre is unnatural, it would be remarkable, and indeed quite inconceivable, that this movement alone should be continuous and eternal, being nevertheless contrary to nature. At any rate, the evidence of all other cases goes to show that it is the unnatural which quickest passes away. And so, if, as some say, the body so moved is fire, this movement is just as unnatural to it as downward movement. For any one can see that fire moves in a straight line away from the centre. On all these grounds, therefore, we may infer with confidence that there is something beyond the bodies that are about us on this earth, different and separate from them, and that the superior glory of its nature is proportionate to its distance from this world of ours. Chapter 3. In consequence of what has been said, in part by way of assumption and in part by way of proof, it is clear that not every body either possesses lightness or heaviness. As a preliminary, we must explain in what sense we are using the words "heavy" and "light", sufficiently at least for our present purpose. We can examine the terms more closely later when we come to consider their essential nature. Let us then apply the term "heavy" to that which naturally moves towards the centre, and "light" to that which moves naturally away from the centre. The heaviest thing will be that which sinks to the bottom of all things that move downward, and the lightest that which rises to the surface of everything that moves upward. Now, necessarily, everything which moves either up or down possesses lightness or heaviness or both, but not both relatively to the same thing, for things are heavy and light relatively to one another. Air, for instance, is light relatively to water, and water light relatively to earth. The body, then, which moves in a circle cannot possibly possess either heaviness or lightness, for neither naturally nor unnaturally can it move either towards or away from the centre. Movement in a straight line certainly does not belong to it naturally, since one sort of movement is, as we saw, appropriate to each simple body, and so we should be compelled to identify it with one of the bodies which move in this way. Suppose, then, that the movement is unnatural. In that case, if it is the downward movement which is unnatural, the upward movement will be natural, and if it is the upward which is unnatural, the downward will be natural. For we decided that of contrary movements, if the one is unnatural to anything, the other will be natural to it. But since the natural movement of the whole and of its part, of earth for instance, as a whole, and of a small clod, have one and the same direction, it results in the first place that this body can possess no lightness or heaviness at all, for that would mean that it could move by its own nature either from or towards the centre, which, as we know, is impossible, and secondly, that it cannot possibly move in the way of locomotion by being forced violently aside in an upward or downward direction. For neither naturally nor unnaturally can it move with any other motion but its own, either itself or any part of it, since the reasoning which applies to the whole applies also to the part. It is equally reasonable to assume that this body will be ungenerated and indestructible and exempt from increase and alteration, since everything that comes to be comes into being from its contrary, and in some substrate, and passes away likewise in a substrate by the action of the contrary into the contrary, as we explained in our opening discussions. Now, the motions of contraries are contrary. If, then, this body can have no contrary, because there can be no contrary motion to the circular, nature seems justly to have exempted from contraries the body which was to be ungenerated and indestructible. For it is in contraries that generation and decay subsist. Again, that which is subject to increase increases upon contact with a kindred body, which is resolved into its matter. But there is nothing out of which this body can have been generated. and if it is exempt from increase and diminution, the same reasoning leads us to suppose that it is also unalterable. For alteration is movement in respect of quality, and qualitative states and dispositions, such as health and disease, do not come into being without changes of properties. But all natural bodies which change their properties we see to be subject without exception to increase and diminution. This is the case, for instance, with the bodies of animals and their parts, and with vegetable bodies, and similarly also with those of the elements. And so, if the body which moves with a circular motion cannot admit of increase or diminution, it is reasonable to suppose that it is also unalterable. The reasons why the primary body is eternal and not subject to increase or diminution, but unaging and unalterable and unmodified, will be clear from what has been said to anyone who believes in our assumptions. Our theory seems to confirm experience and to be confirmed by it. For all men have some conception of the nature of the gods, and all who believe in the existence of gods at all, whether barbarian or Greek, agree in allotting the highest place to the deity, surely because they suppose that immortal is linked with immortal, and regard any other supposition as inconceivable. If then there is, as there certainly is, anything divine, what we have just said about the primary bodily substance was well said. The mere evidence of the senses is enough to convince us of this, at least with human certainty. For in the whole range of time past, so far as our inherited records reach, no change appears to have taken place either in the whole scheme of the outermost heaven or in any of its proper parts. The common name, too, which has been handed down from our distant ancestors even to our own day, seems to show that they conceived of it in the fashion which we have been expressing. The same ideas, one must believe, recur in men's minds not once or twice, but again and again, and so, implying that the primary body is something else beyond earth, fire, air, and water, they gave the highest place a name of its own, ether, derived from the fact that it runs always for an eternity of time. Anaxagoras, however, scandalously misuses this name, taking ether as equivalent to fire. It is also clear from what has been said why the number of what we call simple bodies cannot be greater than it is. The motion of a simple body must itself be simple, and we assert that there are only these two simple motions, the circular and the straight, the latter being subdivided into motion away from and motion towards the centre. Chapter 4. That there is no other form of motion opposed as contrary to the circular may be proved in various ways. In the first place, there is an obvious tendency to oppose the straight line to the circular. For concave and convex are not only regarded as opposed to one another, but they are also coupled together and treated as a unity in opposition to the straight. And so, if there is a contrary to circular motion, motion in a straight line must be recognized as having the best claim to that name. But the two forms of rectilinear motion are opposed to one another by reason of their places. For up and down is a difference, and a contrary opposition in place. Secondly, it may be thought that the same reasoning which holds good of the rectilinear path applies also to the circular, movement from A to B being opposed as contrary to movement from B to A. But what is meant is still rectilinear motion, for that is limited to a single path, while the circular paths, which pass through the same 2 points, are infinite in number. Even if we are confined to the single semicircle, and the opposition is between movement from C to D and from D to C along that semicircle, the case is no better. For the motion is the same as that along the diameter, since we invariably regard the distance between 2 points as the length of the straight line which joins them. It is no more satisfactory to construct a circle and treat motion along one semicircle as contrary to motion along the other. For example, taking a complete circle, motion from E to F on the semicircle G may be opposed to motion from F to E on the semicircle H. But even supposing these are contraries, it in no way follows that the reverse motions on the complete circumference are contraries. Nor again can motion along the circle from A to B be regarded as the contrary of motion from A to C. For the motion goes from the same point towards the same point, and contrary motion was distinguished as motion from a contrary to its contrary. And even if the motion round a circle is the contrary of the reverse motion, one of the two would be ineffective. For both move to the same point, because that which moves in a circle, at whatever point it begins, must necessarily pass through all the contrary places alike. By contrarieties of place I mean up and down, back and front, and right and left. And the contrary oppositions of movements are determined by those of places. One of the motions, then, would be ineffective, for if the two motions were of equal strength, there would be no movement either way, and if one of the two were preponderant, the other would be inoperative, so that if both bodies were there, one of them, inasmuch as it would not be moving with its own movement, would be useless in the sense in which a shoe is useless when it is not worn. But God and nature create nothing that has not its use. End of chapter 4. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards. Of Book 1 of On the Heavens by Aristotle, translated by J. L. Stocks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards. Chapter 5. This being clear, we must go on to consider the questions which remain. First, is there an infinite body, as the majority of the ancient philosophers thought? Or is this an impossibility? The decision of this question, either way, is not unimportant, but rather all-important to our search for the truth. It is this problem which has practically always been the source of the differences of those who have written about nature as a whole. So it has been, and so it must be, since the least initial deviation from the truth is multiplied later 1,000-fold. Admit, for instance, the existence of a minimum magnitude, and you will find that the minimum which you have introduced, small as it is, causes the greatest truths of mathematics to totter. The reason is that a principle is great rather in power than in extent. Hence, that which was small at the start turns out a giant at the end. Now, the conception of the infinite possesses this power of principles, and indeed, in the sphere of quantity, possesses it in a higher degree than any other conception, so that it is in no way absurd or unreasonable that the assumption that an infinite body exists should be of peculiar moment to our inquiry. The infinite, then, we must now discuss, opening the whole matter from the beginning. Every body is necessarily to be classed either as simple or as composite. The infinite body, therefore, will be either simple or composite. But it is clear, further, that if the simple bodies are finite, the composite must also be finite, since that which is composed of bodies finite both in number and in magnitude is itself finite in respect of number and magnitude. Its quantity is in fact the same as that of the bodies which compose it. What remains for us to consider, then, is whether any of the simple bodies can be infinite in magnitude, or whether this is impossible. Let us try the primary body first, and then go on to consider the others. The body which moves in a circle must necessarily be finite in every respect, for the following reasons. 1. If the body so moving is infinite, the radii drawn from the centre will be infinite. But the space between infinite radii is infinite, and by the space between the radii I mean the area outside which no magnitude which is in contact with the two lines can be conceived as falling. This, I say, will be infinite, first, because in the case of finite radii it is always finite, and secondly, because in it one can always go on to a width greater than any given width. Thus the reasoning which forces us to believe in infinite number, because there is no maximum, applies also to the space between the radii. Now the infinite cannot be traversed, and if the body is infinite, the interval between the radii is necessarily infinite. Circular motion, therefore, is an impossibility. Yet our eyes tell us that the heavens revolve in a circle, and by argument also we have determined that there is something to which circular movement belongs. 2. Again, if from a finite time be subtracted, what remains must be finite and have a beginning. And if the time of a journey has a beginning, there must be a beginning also of the movement, and consequently also of the distance traversed. This applies universally. Take a line A, C, E, infinite in one direction, E, and another line B, B, infinite in both directions. Let A, C, E describe a circle, revolving upon C as centre. In its movement it will cut B, B continuously for a certain time. This will be a finite time, since the total time is finite in which the heavens complete their circular orbit, and consequently the time subtracted from it, during which the one line in its motion cuts the other, is also finite. Therefore there will be a point at which A, C, E began for the first time to cut B, B. This, however, is impossible. The infinite, then, cannot revolve in a circle, nor could the world if it were infinite. 3. That the infinite cannot move may also be shown as follows. Let A be a finite line moving past the finite line B. Of necessity, A will pass clear of B, and B of A at the same moment, for each overlaps the other to precisely the same extent. Now, if the two were both moving, and moving in contrary directions, they would pass clear of one another more rapidly. If one were still, and the other moving past it, less rapidly, provided that the speed of the latter were the same in both cases. This, however, is clear, that it is impossible to traverse an infinite line in a finite time. Infinite time, then, would be required. This we demonstrated above in the discussion of movement. And it makes no difference whether a finite is passing by an infinite, or an infinite by a finite. For when A is passing B, then B overlaps A, and it makes no difference whether B is moved or unmoved, except that if both move, they pass clear of one another more quickly. It is, however, quite possible that a moving line should in certain cases pass one which is stationary quicker than it passes one moving in an opposite direction. One has only to imagine the movement to be slow where both move, and much faster where one is stationary. To suppose one line stationary, then, makes no difficulty for our argument, since it is quite possible for A to pass B at a slower rate when both are moving than when only one is. If, therefore, the time which the finite moving line takes to pass the other is infinite, then necessarily the time occupied by the motion of the infinite past the finite is also infinite. For the infinite to move at all is thus absolutely impossible, since the very smallest movement conceivable must take an infinity of time. Moreover, the heavens certainly revolve, and they complete their circular orbit in a finite time, so that they pass round the whole extent of any line within their orbit, such as the finite line A, B. The revolving body, therefore, cannot be infinite. 4. Again, as a line which has a limit cannot be infinite, or, if it is infinite, is so only in length, so a surface cannot be infinite in that respect in which it has a limit, or indeed, if it is completely determinate, in any respect whatever. Whether it be a square, or a circle, or a sphere, it cannot be infinite any more than a foot rule can. There is, then, no such thing as an infinite sphere, or square, or circle, and where there is no circle, there can be no circular movement. And similarly, where there is no infinite at all, there can be no infinite movement. And from this it follows that, an infinite circle being itself an impossibility, there can be no circular motion of an infinite body. 5. Again, take a centre, C, an infinite line, E, B, another infinite line at right angles to it, E, and a moving radius, C, D. C, D will never cease contact with E, but the position will always be something like C, E. C, D cutting E at F. The infinite line, therefore, refuses to complete the circle. 6. Again, if the heaven is infinite and moves in a circle, we shall have to admit that in a finite time it has traversed the infinite. For suppose the fixed heaven infinite, and that which moves within it equal to it. It results that when the infinite body has completed its revolution, it has traversed an infinite equal to itself in a finite time. But that we know to be impossible. 7. It can also be shown, conversely, that if the time of revolution is finite, the area traversed must also be finite. But the area traversed was equal to itself, therefore it is itself finite. We have now shown that the body which moves in a circle is not endless or infinite, but has its limit. Chapter 6. Further, neither that which moves towards, nor that which moves away from the centre can be infinite. For the upward and downward motions are contraries, and are therefore motions towards contrary places. But if one of a pair of contraries is determinate, the other must be determinate also. Now the centre is determined, for from whatever point the body which sinks to the bottom starts its downward motion, it cannot go farther than the centre. The centre, therefore, being determinate, the upper place must also be determinate. But if these two places are determined and finite, the corresponding bodies must also be finite. Further, if up and down are determinate, the indeterminate place is also necessarily determinate. For if it is indeterminate, the movement within it will be infinite, and that we have already shown to be an impossibility. The middle region, then, is determinate, and consequently any body which either is in it or might be in it is determinate. But the bodies which move up and down may be in it, since the one moves naturally away from the centre, and the other towards it. From this alone it is clear that an infinite body is an impossibility. But there is a further point. If there is no such thing as infinite weight, then it follows that none of these bodies can be infinite. For the supposed infinite body would have to be infinite in weight. The same argument applies to lightness, for as the one supposition involves infinite weight, so the infinity of the body which rises to the surface involves infinite lightness. This is proved as follows. assume the weight to be finite, and take an infinite body, A, B, of the weight C. Subtract from the infinite body a finite mass, B, D, the weight of which shall be E. E then is less than C, since it is the weight of a lesser mass. Suppose then that the smaller goes into the greater a certain number of times, and take B, F, bearing the same proportion to B, D, which the greater weight bears to the smaller. For you may subtract as much as you please from an infinite. If now the masses are proportionate to the weights, and the lesser weight is that of the lesser mass, the greater must be that of the greater. The weights, therefore, of the finite and of the infinite body are equal. Again, if the weight of a greater body is greater than that of a less, the weight of G, B, will be greater than that of F, B, and thus the weight of the finite body is greater than that of the infinite. And further, the weight of unequal masses will be the same, since the infinite and the finite cannot be equal. It does not matter whether the weights are commensurable or not. If A, they are incommensurable, the same reasoning holds. For instance, suppose E multiplied by 3 is rather more than C. The weight of 3 masses of the full size of B, D, will be greater than C. We thus arrive at the same impossibility as before. Again, B, we may assume weights which are commensurate, for it makes no difference whether we begin with the weight or with the mass. For example, assume the weight E to be commensurate with C, and take from the infinite mass a part B, D, of weight E. Then let a mass B, F, be taken having the same proportion to B, D, which the two weights have to one another. For the mass being infinite, you may subtract from it as much as you please. These assumed bodies will be commensurate in mass and in weight alike. Nor again does it make any difference to our demonstration whether the total mass has its weight equally or unequally distributed, for it must always be possible to take from the infinite mass a body of equal weight to B, D, by diminishing or increasing the size of the section to the necessary extent. From what we have said, then, it is clear that the weight of the infinite body cannot be finite. It must then be infinite. We have therefore only to show this to be impossible in order to prove an infinite body impossible. But the impossibility of infinite weight can be shown in the following way. A given weight moves a given distance in a given time. A weight which is as great and more moves the same distance in a less time, the times being in inverse proportion to the weights. For instance, if one weight is twice another, it will take half as long over a given movement. Further, a finite weight traverses any finite distance in a finite time. It necessarily follows from this that infinite weight, if there is such a thing, being on the one hand as great and more than as great as the finite, will move accordingly, but being on the other hand compelled to move in a time inversely proportionate to its greatness, cannot move at all. The time should be less in proportion as the weight is greater, but there is no proportion between the infinite and the finite. Proportion can only hold between a less and a greater finite time. And though you may say that the time of the movement can be continually diminished, yet there is no minimum. Nor if there were would it help us. For some finite body could have been found greater than the given finite in the same proportion which is supposed to hold between the infinite and the given finite, so that an infinite and a finite weight must have traversed an equal distance in equal time. But that is impossible. Again, whatever the time, so long as it is finite, in which the infinite performs the motion, a finite weight must necessarily move a certain finite distance in that same time. Infinite weight is therefore impossible, and the same reasoning applies also to infinite lightness. Bodies, then, of infinite weight and of infinite lightness are equally impossible. That there is no infinite body may be shown, as we have shown it, by a detailed consideration of the various cases, but it may also be shown universally, not only by such reasoning as we advanced in our discussion of principles, though in that passage we have already determined universally the sense in which the existence of an infinite is to be asserted or denied, but also suitably to our present purpose in the following way. That will lead us to a further question. Even if the total mass is not infinite, it may yet be great enough to admit a plurality of universes. The question might possibly be raised whether there is any obstacle to our believing that there are other universes composed on the pattern of our own, more than one, though stopping short of infinity. First, however, let us treat of the infinite universally. End of chapter 6. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards. Chapter 7 of Book 1 of On the Heavens by Aristotle, translated by J. L. Stocks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards. Chapter 7. Every body must necessarily be either finite or infinite, and if infinite, either of similar or of dissimilar parts. If its parts are dissimilar, they must represent either a finite or an infinite number of kinds. That the kinds cannot be infinite is evident, if our original presuppositions remain unchallenged. For the primary movements being finite in number, the kinds of simple body are necessarily also finite, since the movement of a simple body is simple, and the simple movements are finite, and every natural body must always have its proper motion. Now, if the infinite body is to be composed of a finite number of kinds, then each of its parts must necessarily be infinite in quantity, that is to say, the water, fire, etc., which compose it. But this is impossible, because, as we have already shown, infinite weight and lightness do not exist. Moreover, it would be necessary also that their places should be infinite in extent, so that the movements too of all these bodies would be infinite. But this is not possible if we are to hold to the truth of our original presuppositions, and to the view that neither that which moves downward, nor, by the same reasoning, that which moves upward, can prolong its movement to infinity. For it is true in regard to quality, quantity, and place alike, that any process of change is impossible which can have no end. I mean, that if it is impossible for a thing to have come to be white, or a cubit long, or in Egypt, it is also impossible for it to be in process of coming to be any of these. It is thus impossible for a thing to be moving to a place at which in its motion it can never by any possibility arrive. Again, suppose the body to exist in dispersion. It may be maintained, none the less, that the total of all these scattered particles, say of fire, is infinite. But body we saw to be that which has extension every way. How can there be several dissimilar elements, each infinite? Each would have to be infinitely extended every way. It is no more conceivable, again, that the infinite should exist as a whole of similar parts. For in the first place there is no other straight movement beyond those mentioned. We must therefore give it one of them. And if so, we shall have to admit either infinite weight or infinite lightness. Nor, secondly, could the body whose movement is circular be infinite, since it is impossible for the infinite to move in a circle. This indeed would be as good as saying that the heavens are infinite, which we have shown to be impossible. Moreover, in general, it is impossible that the infinite should move at all. If it did, it would move either naturally or by constraint. And if by constraint, it possesses also a natural motion, that is to say, there is another place infinite like itself to which it will move. But that is impossible. That in general it is impossible for the infinite to be acted upon by the finite, or to act upon it, may be shown as follows. 1. The infinite cannot be acted upon by the finite. Let A be an infinite, B a finite, C the time of a given movement produced by one in the other. Suppose then that A was heated or impelled or modified in any way, or caused to undergo any sort of movement whatever, by B in the time C. Let D be less than B, and assuming that a lesser agent moves a lesser patient in an equal time, call the quantity thus modified by D E. Then, as D is to B, so is E to some finite quantum. We assume that the alteration of equal by equal takes equal time, and the alteration of less by less, or of greater by greater, takes the same time, if the quantity of the patient is such as to keep the proportion which obtains between the agents greater and less. If so, no movement can be caused in the infinite by any finite agent in any time whatever, for a less agent will produce that movement in a less patient in an equal time, and the proportionate equivalent of that patient will be a finite quantity, since no proportion holds between finite and infinite. 2. The infinite cannot act upon the finite. Nor again can the infinite produce a movement in the finite in any time whatever. Let A be an infinite, B a finite, C the time of action. In the time C, D will produce that motion in a patient less than B, say F. Then take E, bearing the same proportion to D, as the whole BF bears to F. E will produce the motion in BF in the time C. Thus the finite and the infinite effect the same alteration in equal times, but this is impossible, for the assumption is that the greater effects it in a shorter time. It will be the same with any time that can be taken, so that there will be no time in which the infinite can effect this movement. And as to infinite time, in that nothing can move another or be moved by it, for such time has no limit, while the action and reaction have. 3. There is no interaction between infinites. Nor can infinite be acted upon in any way by infinite. Let A and B be infinites, C, D being the time of the action of A upon B. Now the whole B was modified in a certain time, and the part of this infinite, E, cannot be so modified in the same time, since we assume that a less quantity makes the movement in a less time. Let E, then, when acted upon by A, complete the movement in the time D. Then, as D is to CD, so is E to some finite part of B. This part will necessarily be moved by A in the time CD. For we suppose that the same agent produces a given effect on a greater and a smaller mass in longer and shorter times, the times and masses varying proportionately. There is thus no finite time in which infinites can move one another. Is their time then infinite? No, for infinite time has no end, but the movement communicated has. If therefore every perceptible body possesses the power of acting or of being acted upon, or both of these, it is impossible that an infinite body should be perceptible. All bodies, however, that occupy place are perceptible. There is therefore no infinite body beyond the heaven, nor again is there anything of limited extent beyond it. And so beyond the heaven there is no body at all, for if you suppose it an object of intelligence, it will be in a place, since place is what 'within' and 'beyond' denote, and therefore an object of perception. But nothing that is not in a place is perceptible. The question may also be examined in the light of more general considerations as follows. The infinite, considered as a whole of similar parts, cannot on the one hand move in a circle, for there is no centre of the infinite, and that which moves in a circle moves about the centre. Nor again can the infinite move in a straight line, for there would have to be another place infinite like itself to be the goal of its natural movement, and another equally great for the goal of its unnatural movement. Moreover, whether its rectilinear movement is natural or constrained, in either case the force which causes its motion will have to be infinite. For infinite force is force of an infinite body, and of an infinite body the force is infinite. So the motive body also will be infinite. The proof of this is given in our discussion of movement, where it is shown that no finite thing possesses infinite power, and no infinite thing finite power. If then that which moves naturally can also move unnaturally, there will be two infinites, one which causes and another which exhibits the latter motion. Again, what is it that moves the infinite? If it moves itself, it must be animate. But how can it possibly be conceived as an infinite animal? And if there is something else that moves it, there will be two infinites, that which moves and that which is moved, differing in their form and power. If the whole is not continuous, but exists as Democritus and Leucippus think, in the form of parts separated by void, there must necessarily be one movement of all the multitude. They are distinguished, we are told, from one another by their figures, but their nature is one, like many pieces of gold separated from one another. But each piece must, as we assert, have the same motion. For a single clod moves to the same place as the whole mass of earth, and a spark to the same place as the whole mass of fire, so that if it be weight that all possess, no body is, strictly speaking, light, and if lightness be universal, none is heavy. Moreover, whatever possesses weight or lightness will have its place either at one of the extremes or in the middle region. But this is impossible while the world is conceived as infinite. And generally, that which has no centre or extreme limit, no up or down, gives the bodies no place for their motion, and without that movement is impossible. A thing must move either naturally or unnaturally, and the two movements are determined by the proper and alien places. Again, a place in which a thing rests, or to which it moves unnaturally, must be the natural place for some other body, as experience shows. Necessarily, therefore, not everything possesses weight or lightness, but some things do, and some do not. From these arguments, then, it is clear that the body of the universe is not infinite. Chapter 8. We must now proceed to explain why there cannot be more than one heaven. The further question mentioned above. For it may be thought that we have not proved universally of bodies that none whatever can exist outside our universe, and that our argument applied only to those of indeterminate extent. Now, all things rest and move naturally, and by constraint. A thing moves naturally to a place in which it rests without constraint, and rests naturally in a place to which it moves without constraint. On the other hand, a thing moves by constraint to a place in which it rests by constraint, and rests by constraint in a place to which it moves by constraint. Further, if a given movement is due to constraint, its contrary is natural. If then it is by constraint that Earth moves from a certain place to the centre here, its movement from here to there will be natural. And if Earth from there rests here without constraint, its movement hither will be natural. And the natural movement in each case is one. Further, these worlds, being similar in nature to ours, must all be composed of the same bodies as it. Moreover, each of the bodies, fire I mean, and earth, and their intermediates, must have the same power as in our world. For if these names are used equivocally, if the identity of name does not rest upon an identity of form in those elements and ours, then the whole to which they belong can only be called a world by equivocation. Clearly then, one of the bodies will move naturally away from the centre, and another towards the centre, since fire must be identical with fire, earth with earth, and so on, as the fragments of each are identical in this world. That this must be the case is evident from the principles laid down in our discussion of the movements. For these are limited in number, and the distinction of the elements depends upon the distinction of the movements. Therefore, since the movements are the same, the elements must also be the same everywhere. The particles of earth, then, in another world move naturally also to our centre, and its fire to our circumference. This, however, is impossible, since if it were true, earth must in its own world move upwards, and fire to the centre. In the same way the earth of our world must move naturally away from the centre when it moves towards the centre of another universe. This follows from the supposed juxtaposition of the worlds. For either we must refuse to admit the identical nature of the simple bodies in the various universes, or, admitting this, we must make the centre and the extremity one as suggested. This being so, it follows that there cannot be more worlds than one. To postulate a difference of nature in the simple bodies, according as they are more or less distant from their proper places, is unreasonable. For what difference can it make whether we say that a thing is this distance away or that? One would have to suppose a difference proportionate to the distance, and increasing with it. But the form is in fact the same. Moreover, the bodies must have some movement, since the fact that they move is quite evident. Are we to say then that all their movements, even those which are mutually contrary, are due to constraint? No, for a body which has no natural movement at all cannot be moved by constraint. If then the bodies have a natural movement, the movement of the particular instances of each form must necessarily have for goal a place numerically one, i.e. a particular centre, or a particular extremity. If it be suggested that the goal in each case is one in form, but numerically more than one, on the analogy of particulars which are many though each undifferentiated in form, we reply that the variety of goal cannot be limited to this portion or that, but must extend to all alike. For all are equally undifferentiated in form, but any one is different numerically from any other. What I mean is this: if the portions in this world behave similarly both to one another and to those in another world, then the portion which is taken hence will not behave differently either from the portions in another world or from those in the same world, but similarly to them, since in form no portion differs from another. The result is that we must either abandon our present assumptions, or assert that the centre and the extremity are each numerically one. But this being so, the heaven, by the same evidence and the same necessary inferences, must be one only, and no more. A consideration of the other kinds of movement also makes it plain that there is some point to which earth and fire move naturally. For, in general, that which is moved changes from something into something, the starting point and the goal being different in form, and always it is a finite change. For instance, to recover health is to change from disease to health. To increase is to change from smallness to greatness. Locomotion must be similar, for it also has its goal and starting point, and therefore the starting point and the goal of the natural movement must differ in form, just as the movement of coming to health does not take any direction which chance or the wishes of the mover may select. Thus, too, fire and earth move not to infinity, but to opposite points. And since the opposition in place is between above and below, these will be the limits of their movement. Even in circular movement there is a sort of opposition between the ends of the diameter, though the movement as a whole has no contrary, so that here too the movement has in a sense an opposed and finite goal. There must therefore be some end to locomotion. It cannot continue to infinity. This conclusion, that local movement is not continued to infinity, is corroborated by the fact that earth moves more quickly the nearer it is to the centre, and fire the nearer it is to the upper place. But if movement were infinite, speed would be infinite also, and if speed, then weight and lightness. For as superior speed in downward movement implies superior weight, so infinite increase of weight necessitates infinite increase of speed. Further, it is not the action of another body that makes one of these bodies move up and the other down, nor is it constraint, like the extrusion of some writers. For in that case the larger the mass of fire or earth, the slower would be the upward or downward movement. But the fact is the reverse. The greater the mass of fire or earth, the quicker always is its movement towards its own place. Again, the speed of the movement would not increase towards the end if it were due to constraint or extrusion, for a constrained movement always diminishes in speed as the source of constraint becomes more distant, and a body moves without constraint to the place whence it was moved by constraint. A consideration of these points, then, gives adequate assurance of the truth of our contentions. The same could also be shown with the aid of the discussions which fall under first philosophy, as well as from the nature of the circular movement, which must be eternal both here and in the other worlds. It is plain, too, from the following considerations, that the universe must be one. The bodily elements are three, and therefore the places of the elements will be three also. The place first of the body which sinks to the bottom, namely the region about the centre. The place secondly of the revolving body, namely the outermost place. And thirdly the intermediate place belonging to the intermediate body. Here, in this third place, will be the body which rises to the surface, since if not here it will be elsewhere, and it cannot be elsewhere. For we have two bodies, one weightless, one endowed with weight, and below is the place of the body endowed with weight, since the region about the centre has been given to the heavy body, and its position cannot be unnatural to it, for it would have to be natural to something else, and there is nothing else. It must then occupy the intermediate place. What distinctions there are within the intermediate itself we will explain later on. We have now said enough to make plain the character and number of the bodily elements. the place of each, and further, in general, how many in number the various places are. End of chapter 8. Recording in memory of Edwards.